I think what I'm trying to get at is that I watch people, the reason I've never taken a particular interest in philosophy is that once you've taken a particular interest in mathematics, you understand just how sensitive many of these things are to small issues of language, right? And this is partially what happened to philosophy, is that there were a lot of big, interesting questions, and then there was a period of time where it became a focus on language rather than on big, meaningful, meaty questions. I don't know that the human layer supports this level of analysis because of some of the reasons that we're talking about. So, we can notice, I don't even think, for example, that there is a status game. I think that there's a panoply of status games and that they're taking place simultaneously in a million different dimensions. And the key question is, can we isolate the principal components of some of those so that we understand, like, where's the majority of the action happening? Or are we actually doing violence to the problem by virtue of the fact that we've singled out a few of them and then we've misnamed it? Well, that was going on in the status game. So, for example, any univariate measure has the property that it has an ordering on it. But every bivariate measure, unless there's a metric, does not imply an ordering. Like if you have one attribute that's positive that is greater than mine and one that is worse, until we can say in some sense how those two things interrelate, we can't say Agnes is better than Eric or Eric is better than Agnes. However, if there's only one attribute, like who can run faster, then one of us is better and the other of us is worse, unless there's a bizarre tie. Now, what I'm trying to get at is, here we are, 21st century beings, and we're outside of the confines of the academy. And the key question is, what is this philosophical modality doing in our lives? How does it, is the examined life really aided by philosophy, or is there a sort of infinite tower of questions and that it's sort of an intellectual check-kiting scheme by which you keep getting into deeper and deeper water by noticing something only to find out that the noticing created a larger problem than the previous one that you had?
I think one way to put the case for philosophy is like, you have to have a right. You have to, you can't just draw a distinction. You're just not allowed to just draw a distinction. That's why I said the thing about the quadripartite. You're not just allowed to slash the world up into bits. The place where philosophy comes from is Parmenides. Parmenides was really the first philosopher, okay? And, this is pre-Plato, right? This is the pre-Socratic philosophers. And, he like Zeno's paradoxes are sort of woven into Parmenideanism. But the basic idea of Parmenides' basic thought is that there's only one thing you can say. It is. Okay. So there's just one thing, it, and there's one thing you can say about it, that it is. And you're like, well, Parmenides, no, look, there's also like this chair is. And Parmenides says, well, if you say that the chair is, and you want to say that the chair is something and is different from, say, that table, right? Then you're saying that the chair is not the table. So you're saying that the chair is not. But you're also saying that it is. Parmenides and generations of people after Parmenides thought this was like just this really terrible puzzle about how non-being can be. How can there be anything that isn't? Like this chair not being this table. The problem of non-being has a lot of different manifestations. So difference is one manifestation. Change over time. How can the chair at one time exist and then later it's collapsed and it's not there anymore? Parmenides' thought was that our thinking cannot support this way of talking. It's like, it's just words when we talk about the diversity out in the world. And there's only one thing we can coherently say. There's only one thing where when we say it, we've understood what we said, and that's it is. Now, Plato comes along and he's like, no, Parmenides, that's nuts. We have to be able to talk about some kinds of difference, but you're right that the entire world as we see it, right? The entire sensible world, that's just nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. That's a bunch of contradictions. But there are these things called forms, okay? Like the beautiful or the just or whatever. And at least the beautiful, it's always beautiful. The only thing that's true about it is that it is beautiful. And that's something I can say. The beautiful is beautiful. The just is just. So at least I'm like one step beyond Parmenides, right? I'm like, I can talk about these forms. I still can't talk about the chair, right? Okay, and then you get Aristotle, and Aristotle is like, no, guys, we have to be able to talk about like human beings and things, and we need to enrich our language further. Now, the reason I bring all this up is that the basic philosophical impulse is that when you draw distinctions and you carve things up and you talk about layers, okay, you've in a sense collapsed your own thought into a bunch of different things that are like not unified, right? And you need to be able to see the unity of them. If you can't, you haven't actually had a thought, like you haven't thought anything. You've just said words. So philosophers are constantly attuned to this worry that we might just be saying words and not having thoughts, and that there's a standard for the unity of a thought that's like a pretty high standard. And so like if you draw a distinction, you need to understand the unity that underlies the distinction and what legitimates the distinction. And so like, if I say even like I ate the cookie even though I knew that it wasn't the right thing to do, and you're like, well, wait a minute, you freely ate the cookie? You chose to eat the cookie? Yes. So that was an intentional action? Yes. So an intentional action is when we have a reason? Yes. So a reason means that you think that it's all things considered the best thing to do? Yes, that's what a reason is. Wait a minute, you just said you thought it was all things considered the best thing to do, and you thought that there was something better that you should do. You just contradicted yourself, right? And Parmenides thought that contradicting yourself was written into this is a chair and this is a table, right? And so so we've come really far. We can talk about so much now, but only, I think, because only if we can sort of back those checks that these distinctions have some way of like holding together.
Breathe with me. Yeah, I don't know why I'm so singularly unmoved by this kind of thinking.
Well, object to it.
Well,
where did I go wrong? Find one place I went wrong.
Hegel at some point said, the absolute idea, the idea's unity of the subjective and objective idea, is the notion of the idea, a notion whose object is the idea as such, and for which objective is idea, an object embracing all characteristics in its unity.
Okay.
When I talk like that, I sound insane to myself. And the key question for me is, what is an idea that settles down when its analysis doesn't sort of alter and destroy it? It's sort of a fixed point, if you will, under analysis. So if I communicate, the problem with, let's say, with the status game with which we began our discussion is that in some cases, when you call attention to your need for status, you diminish your status.
That's also true, though. I think that's not the only reason why you can't call attention.
But there are ways in which you can try to call attention to your status, in which the amount of status that you achieve by calling attention to your status remains constant, that the calling doesn't effectively alter the problem. For example, you might signal that you're comfortable enough in your own skin to talk about a part of your mind's petty needs and a part of your mind's reasonable needs for status. I have both, for example. And I don't think it's a terrible thing to say that there are times when I simply want to be regarded because I am, and that there are times that I want to be regarded because it is important not to derange a conversation. Let's say I only have 45 minutes for something, and if we begin with the wrong notion of who I am, it will take too long. So there's always this question, in the bad breath example, the problem is that the talking about it has to do with an interpretive complex or on client side in inside your interlocutor's mind. And so your input stimulates a process that is transpiring within the client side architecture, and it leads to an uncomfortable and unpleasant and not untrue outcome. If I could find the input, which when processed remains the input, right? In other words, it's like an eigenvalue of truth, an eigenvector of truth, then that's something which is philosophically interesting to me. What concerns me is the tower of concepts and conflicts which don't seem to settle down the more we understand them.
So one thing is, I really liked what you said about Hegel. When I talk like that, I sound crazy to myself. So I think that is Parmenides' point about saying that something is not. Parmenides is the guy who realized, when I talk like that, when I say the chair is not the table, I sound crazy to myself. You're really used to talking that way because that's just how we talk. Parmenides saw the giant crack in everything, right?
Okay.
And so if you think about how, like when I hear someone say, I know I shouldn't have this cookie, but I really feel like it, so I'm going to have it. If I talk like that, I sound crazy to myself. And so I'm like, I can't talk like this. I have to find another way of talking.
Okay, so that's the idea that at some level, first of all, you need a primary description of it. Most of us understand weakness of will intuitively, but we don't understand weakness of will as is emergent from fundamental principles.
And I think you don't understand it intuitively. You just think you do.
Well, again,
you can pick out the phenomenon. You can point to cases of it.
To your point about the practicality, you may be able to work with it at a practical level. So, for example, I might be able to sell a product where you put cookies in a time-release safe, and so you can't get at your own cookies until one is dispensed to you. People will immediately understand that. But the key question is, can I take a placebo and get the placebo effect if it's labeled placebo? These are the sort of unstable, non-fixed points of the philosophical problem. One of the reasons that I really love physics as an alternative to philosophy at its ground level is that it tends to be stable under analysis when we have an idea of it. Now, in quantum mechanics, the propagation in quantum mechanics has a very stable interpretation. It may be wrong, but we think we know what's going on when we're asking how an electron moves. Mm-hmm. It's when an electron gets measured when you're asking a bad question, which is, are you in state A or state B? And it was in state A plus B. Mm-hmm. Then the multiple choice nature of that quantum mechanical question is bizarrely accommodated by the system somewhat randomly falling into state A or state B as a weighted probability. Now, that bothers us because we have the sense that maybe that's not really a fixed point. Did we know what we were when we asked the question? Were we part of the quantum system? Did we hold ourselves aside and keep ourselves classical while asking that the electron be considered quantum mechanically? Was it in a semi-quantum, semi-classical state? So we're not really sure whether we've committed a sin against God and logic in that case.
Yeah, good. I mean, I think that a lot of your worries about the tower and the I still think they go back to something. There's a question whether we ever make any progress in a conversation. That seems to me to be the real question there. Like, can we learn from each other? And can we learn from each other in some sense without making any without taking as the frame of our conversations something that we just happen to get slotted into and that we don't question, right? And I actually think that it's true about philosophy that you are not guaranteed in any way that the answer to that question is yes. You don't know that it's yes. And
you've had epiphanies in conversations which have changed your life?
My problem is that I have too many of them, but yeah.
Okay.
It's not
must
a dearth
be an awesome life.
It's not a dearth of epiphanies. It's a total instability. But can I just say there's this moment, okay? Like I feel like you're Meno, okay? This is Plato's Meno, and they're having this conversation. Socrates is like, you're a big opponent of excellence. Meno comes to Socrates and he's like, I want excellence. How do I get it? And Socrates is like, well, let's start by figuring out what it is. And Meno's like, that's not hard, right? That's super easy. Meno says it's easy about like 7 times in a row. It's really funny. He's like, here's what it is. And Socrates like refutes him a bunch of times. And at a certain point, Meno's like, look, this is not going anywhere. Like, obviously you can just sort of come up with more words against my words. How do we ever know we'll ever get anywhere with this, right? And Socrates actually at that point turns to math, and they use a mathematical example about finding the double square. So if you have a square and you want to find the square whose area is twice as big as that square, and how somebody who goes into that problem making a certain set of assumptions will never find the answer. We can talk about it if you want. It's a great example. But the point is, afterwards, Socrates is like, yeah, the truth is, there is no guarantee. We don't know, right? But I think that it is better we will be better men and braver if we believe that we ought to inquire than not. And, you say you like physics, but I don't see it as an alternative in the sense that it's not going to give me, it's the levels problem, right? It's just physics is not going to give me the answer to the questions I have. And I can't just abandon those questions. And I would be a coward if I didn't try to find answers to them.
Well, coward is in a very high state of the stack, high level of the stack, right? In some sense, the questions that really have come to animate me throughout my adult life have to do with this question: is how can we improve upon it is without involving ourselves in the equation?
Maybe that's a good, I'm mostly interested in the equations that essentially involve me.
Right.
So that might be a big difference.